The density of the crowd here today, which might have something to do with the fact that we are just awaiting finals weekend. But anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and start off with an introduction, even though Josh isn't here yet. He'll probably walk in as I am talking. Is that him? Oh yeah, that's him. Okay, yeah. Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. I think this is going to be a really interesting debate. It's on a topic that is a favorite of most King students, that is education. The formal title of our motion today is "This House Regrets the Decline of Classical Education." In favor of that motion, we have on the government side Luke Troborst, Noah Heinz, and Josh Craddock. In opposition, we have Hannah Herman, Greg Dubois, and Will Malson. They're going to be defending the crazy liberal side of the debate stage. Anyway, that being said, we again appreciate you for coming out, and I'll hand it over to our moderator, Burke.
Are you timing?
It will be time to defend the motion. It is being 7 minutes long. That this House regrets the decline of the classical education.
Okay, thanks, Burke. Thanks, John, for setting this up. Thank you, other debaters. I'd like to start with an anecdote from William Bagley. William Bagley was an educationist in around 1940, and he was dealing with progressive educators at the time. He made an analogy. He said, if I had to choose between the most up-to-date technology from Johns Hopkins University, a recent grad, or Hippocrates, the father of medicine, I'd choose the recent grad from Johns Hopkins. But if I had to choose who to teach my adolescent son, I wouldn't choose a graduate of the Teachers College. I'd choose Socrates. The point is, even as we've gotten older, even as our society has matured, that doesn't mean our ability to educate children has gotten any better. Today, we're here to defend classical education. What is classical education? Classical education focuses on the best that's been thought and said. It's oriented towards a way of thinking. A classical education isn't, someone who's been classically educated isn't focused on, say, job training skills or the utility of education, but instead focuses on the cultivation of the entire human person. John Henry Newman says that it's the goal of training good members of society. It's the education which gives man a clear conscious view of their own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. In the words of Robert Frost, it's the marking of men with taste and judgment. So in terms of actually curricular differentiation, what does this look like? The difference between classical education and the modern system of education, say that's showed in the Common Core that's currently in place, is in particular in the early grades, focus on reading, phonics, and historical content. In the middle grades, logic. In high school, things like philosophy, writing and speaking, and perhaps most controversially, studying ancient languages and older texts. Now, the motion today can be interpreted two ways. In regretting the decline of classical education, we first of all regret that classical education is not currently taught at almost any high schools across the country. But it second of all means that we regret the historical event that was the decline in classical education, particularly the replacement of classical education with progressive education. Progressivism emphasizes utility, and it came into vogue in the early 20th century. Everything in the progressive curriculum that dominated the early half of last century emphasized on whether or not something would be useful to the experiences of children in the curriculum. As one Alabama school in the 30s put it, call us when you need workers. So the point of these schools, progressive schools, was to emphasize things that students would actually experience and to create people who could be good with their jobs. This meant a decline in the academic curriculum. So we see throughout the 1960s and 70s, consistently, schools across the country had dropping SAT scores, dropping scores on NAEP tests, and other such things. By the early 1980s, there was an academic meltdown. In A Nation at Risk, a report put together by the Reagan administration, it found that students across the country performed significantly lower than all international students. For instance, take California in the early 1980s. The only statewide requirement to graduate in the early 1980s was 2 years of physical education. 45% of students were assigned to a track that emphasized courses like typing, cultural awareness, homemaking, restaurant management, food for singles, exploring childhood, scuba diving, clothing. Fewer than 1/5 of high school students in California were completing even one single homework assignment every week. 1/5, less than 1/5, were completing a single homework assignment every week. Now, obviously, things have gotten better since then, and it's come as we've taken a return to the Common Core, the core curriculum as emphasized by E.D. Hirsch, a core that emphasizes cultural literacy and immersing students in the literature of our time and the time of times past. But this hasn't gone far enough, and it's not offered to enough students. I'm going to be emphasizing two main advantages of the classical education. First of all, the emphasis that classical education prepares good civic students who are free from the prejudices of their particular time. And second of all, that it encourages moral education. Now, according to Robert Hutchins, who was a critic of progressive education throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, progressive education is no more than a preparation for the status quo. That's because students are constantly taught what they'll be experiencing in the world around them. And so therefore, they learn to just accept the values of the status quo. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what's emphasized in education in a moment, by, for instance, C.S. Lewis, who argues that we need to be reading old books, books of previous times, to combat the specific, certain mistakes of specific ages. Greg, you would disagree.
Right, so classical education indoctrinates students with the values of the past. How is that any better than what you call the indoctrination of the values of the present?
That's because it's very easy to see what went wrong in past ages. Anyone can critique slavery. It's much harder to see the problems of a specific age. As Lewis says, every age is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to making certain mistakes. We need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. De Tocqueville talks about this frequently as well. He says, an equal society like ours tends towards specific social values. Democratic individualism tends to make each man forget his own ancestors, and instead force him to sever himself from the mass of his fellows and to draw apart with his family and friends. So he accepts the values of society at large. The second main point that I want to emphasize is the value of the moral education of a classical education. Recently, Supreme Court decisions like Wallace v. Jaffrey and Lee v. Wiseman have taken away prayer in school, have taken away even prayer before graduations in Lee v. Wiseman. Leaving aside the particular constitutional questions in play here, it's clear that currently we think of education as morally neutral, as amoral. The idea is that students will sort of assimilate the proper virtues just naturally by fitting in their communities, and that schools don't need to specifically focus on giving moral content to students. Classical education questions this Rousseauian understanding of how morality is passed down through generations. By emphasizing conforming students to specific external standards of virtue, which are not taught in current education, which instead focuses on things like diversity and multiculturalism, and exposing students to multitude of different ideas and not forcing them to choose any of them. It forces students not to judge, not to be discerning. Classical education says exactly the opposite. By exposing students to the values of previous times and forcing them to take responsibility and become virtuous students. For that reason, we proudly support this motion.
Thank the Prime Minister. Now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to give 8 minutes each against the motion. Hear, hear.
Is my timer ready? Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to do 3 points of rebuttal, and I'm going to talk to you about, firstly, why classical education worked in the past. Secondly, why it won't work now. And thirdly, what students actually need to be functioning good citizens in today's world. So firstly, I think it's interesting that Luke tries to back us into a corner where he says, well, what we have to do is, our job is to regret the event that led to the decline of classical education, i.e. the dawn of progressive education. Mr. Speaker, we don't think that's our burden in this debate. We think our burden is significantly different. We don't have to stand up here and say progressive education was awesome and they did it the right way. We actually disagree. We think there were a lot of flaws with that particular progressive model. What we think, though, is that we can regret the decline of classical education while still advocating maybe other alternatives, like magnet schools or things that don't necessarily conform to his particular vision of classical education, but still don't have the flaws of past progressive education. Secondly, he says that classical education is great because it teaches the values of the past and it inculcates kids with those historic virtues. Firstly, he never tells us why this is better, so we'd really like a response to that. And secondly, he doesn't tell us why this is unique to classical education, because we think you can still teach history and still not teach it classically or have like a completely classical curriculum. We don't think it's unique. But thirdly, he says that classical education is good because it's a moral education. Two points of rebuttal. Firstly, again, we don't think this is unique or inherent. They haven't showed us particularly how you get that benefit only from classical education. But secondly, so kids are not learning morals, so you're going to let them read pagan myths and godless philosophy instead, right? Like, that doesn't make a ton of sense when you look at the best that's been thought and said. A lot of it's actually pretty godless, pretty immoral or amoral. We don't think they necessarily, like, that might not be the best way to teach kids morality. Okay, firstly, why did classical education work in the past? We'd say that classical education emerged and was successful within a very particular historical context. Firstly, in a time of great wealth disparity. So in ancient classical Greece, right, education was a luxury for the property class who had the time for scholarly pursuits and were expected to devote their entire lives to scholarly pursuits. It wasn't for, say, like the average Joe who had to work on the farm to feed his family. But secondly, it emerged and was successful in a time of very concentrated political power, meaning that classical education was specifically designed to train the few to directly lead the many. So it was designed to train the men who participated in the Forum of Athens or later on in the aristocracies of Europe to lead the huddled masses who remained uneducated. So why won't classical education work now? Well, we'd say firstly that we've realized that education is a commodity that everyone should have because it helps them advance themselves. But we'd say that education is only valuable insofar as it makes society better off. So classical education, ladies and gentlemen, may make for a few awesome philosophers who have the time and the resources to devote their entire lives to philosophy, but it doesn't do much to increase the aggregate happiness of everyone else. Why? Because they're going to be unprepared to do the things they have to do to make money, to get an actual job, to survive in the real world. So this means that they tend to live less happy lives because they don't have the opportunities or the skills they need to produce things, to make things, to work, to live. They also wind up being dependent on the educated few and stuck doing their menial labor because they don't have the practical skills they need. So it's not just about advancement, Mr. Speaker, it's about subsistence. It's about giving people the skills they need to survive in a technologically advancing world. Go.
You've said you rejected progressivism, but all I'm hearing is just a repeat of John Dewey and everything else that talks about aggregate happiness. Where is the disagreement
Okay,
with the progressives here?
so what we say is the way progressive education was implemented was probably the source of a lot of the things that went wrong with it. We'd say we can fix those, we can come up with a better model. This isn't a debate about how we're going to change education policy-wise. This is a debate about what education should do for the people it's claiming to educate, right? Okay. So what do most people need today? We'd say that most people in the modern world need an education that does two things. Firstly, they need an education that prepares them for a more competitive atmosphere. So, Mr. Speaker, imagine that you spend the first 12 years of your life studying the classics, the best that's been thought and said, which we also object to because we don't think you can make that judgment this early in human history. But anyway, we say that then you decide after 12 years of classical education that you want to be a doctor or an engineer or a genetic researcher, right? We'd say that you're significantly worse off. Why? Firstly, because you've probably had a less rigorous foundation in things like hard math and science. While the quadrivium does include that to a certain extent, the focus of classical education is undeniably on rhetoric and philosophy, and you're going to have to do a whole lot more remedial work when you are in college to catch up. But secondly, we'd say you are disadvantaged because you've had less early exposure, right? So the learning curve once you decide to study engineering in college is going to be significantly steeper, which means you're more likely to be less competitive in your field, to kind of just do the bare minimum, like get it to the point where you can get an engineering degree and not spend your college years actually doing deep research or things like that. So what are the harms? Firstly, we'd say it means that there are fewer engineers and doctors because it's harder to transition from a classical education to the type of undergrad degree you'd need if you actually want to be a doctor or an engineer. Secondly, you get less advanced experts because they spend more time playing catch up and trying to learn the basic things that they maybe didn't learn in high school, or the practical application in calculus and things like that. But thirdly, we'd say you get fewer innovations because people now focus on catching up in grad school and doing remedial work rather than actually innovating. But secondly, we'd say that people need an education that prepares them for emerging sectors, right? And we'd say classical education fails in two ways with this. So firstly, there's this idea that bettering your soul via philosophy is better than any practical skill you could ever come to have. And secondly, this focus on the best that's been thought and said. So we'd say that classically educated people, especially if they're classically educated K through 12, are far less likely to enter technological or practical fields to begin with. Why? Because it's not as good, Mr. Speaker, because for the first 12 years of their life, they've been told that what's best for them is to study philosophy. They will have absolutely no desire, or a far less of a desire, to do things like being a doctor, like being a paramedic, like being an engineer, like designing bridges, because it's not philosophy, Mr. Speaker. It's not the highest good, even though it brings immeasurable practical goods for them and for society. But secondly, we'd say that most people need to enter these emerging sectors like IT and engineering because that's how they're actually going to have a chance to make money. So not only does classically education make them less likely or less prepared to enter those sectors, but it makes them less likely to want to enter them, which means they're stuck trying to get a job in philosophy, which doesn't pay a lot of money. So, Mr. Speaker, when you weigh this round, what we want you to weigh it on is whether or not the world we would have had classical education remained the norm, been a better world. We say quite adamantly no, because you would have fewer people doing things like being doctors. For all those reasons, we are proud to oppose.
The leader of the opposition now call on Deputy Prime Minister to give a speech 8 minutes long in defense of the motion. Hear, hear.
I think it's important in this round to remember what Luke's POI was. She got up and said, well, we don't really have to say that we support progressive education or even any of the things that have happened the way things went. Instead, we can just substitute something. And then they didn't really give us a clear idea of what they're substituting in its place. So we'd say it's illegitimate to just say, well, we'd just do it, everything would just be perfect this time. They can't say, we don't regret the decline of it because we'd rather it have just all worked out. We're saying one of the reasons it didn't work out was because of the decline of classical education. We'd say, secondly, it's also important to realize that they're saying it's a problem of implementation, trying to do this hand-waving. But if you notice the arguments that I'm going to continue to make, and that Luke already made, what we're saying is that those problems of implementation are actually problems intrinsic to the progressive project because of a flawed understanding of human nature that leads to the results they didn't expect, results that are very bad, results that if you had a correct view of human nature, you would have been able to predict. And no amount of saying, well, we failed in the implementation because we didn't get the results we wanted is actually going to solve that problem. They have to deal with it on the merits. Okay, and then they're just like, well, why are the ideas and values of the past better? And we'd say, we're not saying you should just like indoctrinate according to what someone would have done in the 15th century specifically. We're not talking about any one specific year. Now they're saying like the one modern year versus a different year. We're actually saying the wide swath of the past, what's been recognized to have been true of different ages throughout, together educating the moderns rather than something the last 10 years. So you can see it's not 1 year versus one other year, which is, we agree, just as likely to be flawed. It's 1 year against the entirety of human history, in which the valleys and the crests are more obvious from the perspective we now have. And we'd say from that perspective, you can definitely see more than you merely see on this current age. And they're just like, well, what do you mean, virtue? You're just reading pagan authors. And we'd say, if you read the Iliad, no one's thinking, wow, I really want to be like Achilles, right? A lot of these stories are designed to show just how bad it is if you have the wrong view. And we think that educating people in this manner allows them to see moral development of important characters in literature. And again, the best that has been thought and said. No, obviously, we're not saying you can't ever add to that canon. The point is, these things have endured. They're classics for a reason. They have something to teach. Then they said education is only valuable insofar as it benefits society. That's just completely false. Think about when you read a book and it affects you, and you see something valuable in that. It can be glorifying to God on a Christian tradition. It can be beneficial to your soul. You can be a better person. That doesn't have to benefit society for it to be a good thing. It can be an intrinsically good thing for you and for the people you know. We think it will lead to benefits for society, but we think that's an unfair metric in today's debate. Plus, progressivism has disastrously damaged society. I'm going to go through that a little bit as well. Less happy lives because they can't make things or something like that. We just don't buy that there's all these really super happy people because they're materialistic. It seems like that's actually not the case. People who only care about making things tend to be very empty and dissatisfied with their lives. Then she's just like, well, it only works for the elite, something like that. We'd say that we're not saying you should just totally switch over. Every single person must be educated classically. Obviously, that would be completely impractical. Someone needs to be a plumber. Some person might want to be a plumber. We'd say that at the point where you can say in today's society that you cannot open a charter school that's a classical school, when that is not allowed because they think that it would be such an inferior education, that is a bad thing. It should be something in the mix. It has value, and we regret that it has declined to the extent that it has. We think that's a fair debate that they can have, right? And then they said, not a good doctor, that type of thing. We'd like to bring up that philosophy majors actually score better on the GMAT, for example, than other majors do. We'd say that finding some intrinsic motivation in studying things that are very abstract trains the mind in a very valuable way. These people tend to do great things in life. Lots of people, for example, lots of famous CEOs were philosophy majors. We think the same principles apply in this case. And then they said must take remedial classes or something. They'll have to do that. We'd say that happens already in the status quo. Almost 80% of all New York City high school graduates who want to enroll in the city university's community college system must relearn basic reading, writing, and math. Think about that number. 80% going to community college. You think that's because of classical education? Do you think that the school that Ray Davison went to, for example, has anything like that percentage, or Great Hearts Academy? Do you really think that the problem, the main reason people have to go through remedial education in reading, writing, and math is because they had a classical education that emphasized Plato? No, that's ridiculous. That's not happening, and they can't point to that in the real world. And then they said, well, what if they want to be doctors? We'd say, okay, maybe they're still doctors and a little bit less materialistic about it and read something on the side. Being a full person, not only obsessed with work, is a very good thing for you and a very good thing for society. Also, we need more engineers. That's just false. We'd say, and a lot of times, you don't necessarily do that. You already see tons of people getting junk degrees in literature that are completely worthless. We'd rather them switch that over to classical education. We'd say all those people could switch over and you'd still have all your engineers. But beyond that, in Soviet Union, for example, thought that and tried to dictate, oh, more engineers. They had 3 times the number that the US had, and they still lost the space race. We don't think you can play that type of numbers game. We think that's a completely made-up argument. My 2 points I'm going to bring you that are going to be interconnected. The first are the leftist arts, and the second is the core of freedom. So the leftist arts, obviously, it's an incredibly clever pun on the liberal arts to say leftist, because we're being the liberals in this debate, but not really. So an important something important that happened on April 26th was Donald Kagan's farewell lecture at Yale University. In 1990, he was ousted as the dean of Yale College for arguing for the value of Western civilization in a core curriculum. He had recently gotten $20 million from a donor to found a Western civilization core class at Yale material that people were going to be required to take. As a result of that lecture, he ended up being forced to resign as dean, and his class was scrapped. People in the campus editorial accused him of racism and said that he was just a peddler of European cultural arrogance. We'd say that is the failure that we regret, and that has led to, in his own words, a cultural void and ignorance of the past and a sense of rootlessness and aimlessness. And that's what practical education that only is for the benefit of society leads to, we'd say. Hannah.
What differentiates a junk literature degree from a degree in, say, the classics or classical education?
We'd say the core class requirement. I'm going to get into that. So he also said, freedom and a free society can only be taught. It doesn't come in nature. So let's look at the core class requirements. According to the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, students at Johns Hopkins, Yale, Brown, Cornell, Amherst, University of California system, thousands of others across the nation, do not require their graduates to take more than one of the following 7 subjects to graduate: math, science, history, economics, literature, foreign language, composition. Only one of those 7. You can graduate with such a limited education that you've only taken one of those. And we'd say that's a really bad thing because students don't actually know what's best for them. They're born in a state of slavishness to their desires and need to be educated to go beyond that. We'd say that's the basis of the liberal education rather than the Rousseauian education they're proposing on this side of the house, where someone's born free and can merely make choices. When people make choices like that, they make the wrong choices and they choose to research things that are not worth researching, that do not lead to freedom, and do not help society. For all those reasons, we regret the decline of classical education.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to give an 8-minute speech against the motion. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to go through my rebuttal as quickly as I can and then give you 3 points of extension. The first, as framework, why classical education is not an inherent good, it is an instrumental good, and any education should be seen as an instrumental good. Secondly, why classical education is one size fits all, and that's actually bad, contrary to what Noah was just arguing. And finally, how ultimately we think that if there's more freedom and more diversity within the educational options available to us, which is one of the benefits of the progressive movement, which they've completely ignored, then we have a better society overall. Why? Because let's face it, not everyone is going to be a leader. Not everyone is going to be a brilliant scholar who can actually interact with the great tradition and contribute to it. We don't think we should be forcing them to go through this for the first 12 years of their lives when they already get some sense of the aptitude of where they want to go themselves and when there could be other options available. My rebuttal. Number 1, where do we agree and disagree with the progressive education? We would say that we most fervently align with the vocational camp within the progressive movement. Now, let's be clear. There are lots and lots and lots of different angles within the progressive movement that was, in general, against the classical education. First was the vocational camp. They said, no, education should be about preparing people to exist in the realities of society. Classical education gets them stuck in this academic world where they don't even know how to have a job interview and hold a job, and they don't learn any necessary skills. So that's where we most strongly align. That's where Hannah's analysis falls. The other sad harms that come from what most of the opposition has argued come from 2 other things: the life adjustment movement and the child-centered movement. Both of these tried to make education aligned very, very closely with the sort of temporary desires that they're so concerned with. The little things that we want within a very short amount of time that are not really good desires necessarily, they're very transient and temporary. That was life adjustment. Child-centered, we agree with to a certain extent in that we think that education should be molded to fit the way children learn, and again, there should be variety there. But we don't agree that education should just play to the child's every whim, which is where we do separate a bit from the Rousseauian theory of education. So ultimately, we think, though, even if we have to take them, even if we have to say this is what happened, because yes, those things did happen, we still think that overall the movement is better, particularly in the long run. Why? Because the vocational camp led to the creation of magnet schools that emphasize things like entrepreneurship, economic research and think tanks, political engagements, the science magnet school in the Bronx, where people can go at a young age and become incredibly, incredibly well-versed in these very beneficial roles of society that they seem to think are somewhat less than. And we don't think we would have had this if the classical education movement had persisted. Why is this? Because the classical system inherently puts those subjects as less important on their curricula. You heard it from them themselves. They prioritize things like public speaking, moral education, quote unquote, studying the best that's been taught and said. You're not going to get as much science, you're not going to get as much math, you're not going to get as much business. We think that these things we lose out on in the side of the world where classical education maintains itself and increases. Second point of rebuttal. We're wondering why they're they're not accepting this burden of proving that everyone needs to be classically educated. Because they seem to be saying that all these, well, it seems to me that the benefits to classical education that they're talking about are largely universal, right? Everyone could benefit from moral education. Everyone, the way they're phrasing it, could benefit from studying the classics and engaging with these other viewpoints, right? But why are they backing away from folding that burden? Because we think that they know that there are harms implicit. And I just mentioned those harms. We think that if classical education is as good as they say it is, they need to tell us why the world would be better off if everyone was classically educated. We're waiting for that, and we haven't heard it yet. Fourth point of rebuttal. What about these philosophers scoring on the GMAT and the remedial classes and all these things? Do we really get the benefits that we think on our side? Well, number one, you don't take the GMAT to get into med school. It's a much harder exam. Hannah can tell you all about it after the round. Number two, yeah, remedial classes happen, but we don't think that's the fault of the progressive movement as a whole. We recognize that education has generally failed, but we think it's a mistake to look at history very, very broadly and say, oh, this started here, therefore it must have caused X, Y, and Z. We think a lot of other things cause these. For example, economic depression that led to reduced budgets for teachers. Teachers lose, like 50% of the teacher staff in the school
On that point.
Chicago was axed in 1 year. 1 year. We think that's the type of things that lead to it. And
Greg.
furthermore, we think that later on, what we have in the 70s, this drive for like standardizing education, that also inflated standards. And when standards get inflated, that's when you have people's education tanking. It's not because of the progressive movement on the whole. It's definitely not because of the vocational movement's goals. The goals of the vocational movement would necessarily go against any grade inflation whatsoever. So we don't think that we can be beholden to the harms that they're talking about necessarily either. We would disagree with that just as much. Finally, his two substantive points. The first, the idea of the leftist arts. Basically, the progressive movement led to a society full of condemnation, cultural void, ruthlessness, aimlessness. The guy from Harvard got kicked out and called sexist. Again, I see no link to this to the progressive movement, and I'm waiting for them to supply me one. And then second, it's bad to know not a variety of things. I think it's equally bad to be forced to learn a variety of things when they won't benefit you later on in your real life. Now, they think that it will. They think that it will, and that it will create a more well-rounded person. But they've been using very interesting language to describe that. I also think that I can get these benefits on my own outside of an educational system, particularly if I have a family who thinks this as well and is willing to take the time to educate me on it. Yes, go ahead.
So would you contest our point that people start out not wanting to learn the correct things and thus will not choose to learn those things?
I am right down the middle on that because I do recognize that people don't always know what they want. They don't always know necessarily what's good for them. But I think then the job of society is not to expose them and force them to learn into a cased system where values are interpreted or placed upon them through this classical education. I think at that point, our job is to offer them options, show them where they could be in 10 years, and then have them say, I want to be a scientist, I want to be a businessman, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a philosopher. If they want to be a philosopher, go get that classical education, because that's when they need to engage in those ideas. We recognize that on the whole. So, my points of substantive matter, once I find them. All right, number one, classical education, or education as a whole, should not be conceived of as an inherent good. What you have on the government side is a line that very firmly demonstrates that education on the whole is an inherent good. You're always going to get something good when you study, say, the classics. I don't think this is entirely true. Why is this? Because I know that I studied the classics, and I know that I experienced the benefits far less than a lot of you all in the audience here, because I don't know them as well. Why? Because I was forced to study them, interestingly enough. So there's already a disparity of the value that you get out of this. More importantly, I think that ultimately, education serves an end, and the end is to better the person. Now, in some ways, you can better the person through studying great books. But generally, we think it's best if you leave it up to the person themselves to decide whether they think that the classical education will be an impediment to their later career, and they'd rather study the science in the place of that in the curriculum. We're talking about marginal changes that lead to huge payouts in the end. We think that classical education is a problem for point number two because it is one size fits all. It's, number one, a rigid learning environment that doesn't take into account the multiplicity of learning styles that many children have today. today. The fact that they don't like to sit around and memorize crazy vocabulary terms. They don't learn it because they don't self-select. And then they fail on their tests themselves. And secondly, because the content matter is very restrictive. As I said in my rebuttal, you're not going to get the education in science you need in order to be competitive against everyone else who's gone to magnet schools around the country to get ahead in science so they can get those jobs. We think those are serious harms for the individual, but we think the greatest harm of all, ultimately, and this leads me to my last point, is that the people in our society are ultimately being forced in their world to undergo this because they believe that it is universally good for them. We think that the world is better off when there are a multiplicity of options of education out there, that all of them can succeed in their own, but that in the end, philosophers get the classical education and the businessmen get the business education. We oppose.
The opposition, and now call upon the opposition whip to close out the debate for opposite side in a 5-minute long speech against the motion here.
All right, thanks everyone for coming out. We have a good audience. I'll try and close this down as best we can for our side. Look forward to seeing what Josh has to say for government side. I'm going to have 3 crystallizing points for my whip speech. The first is utility versus the soul. The second is practical consequences or actual history. And the final is specialization and exchange, that intro to econ term that we all learned from Brendan. So first on utility versus the soul, 3 subpoints. Subpoint A is false notions of pure utility. And what government has been debating this entire time is basically putting us into the position, as Hannah said in her LO, that we're supporting progressive education and that's all we are. It's all about pure utility. And this is basically a straw man, as we've been saying. That's not what we're all about. The B here is false notions of a better soul. That's also not simply what education should be. Now, over here on our side, we've been arguing a little bit for vocation. We've also said we should be better by education, but it seems that the government wants to take the hardline stance that education is simply about bettering the soul, and if society is bettered as a consequence of that, that's okay, but that's not really the point. It's all about the individual person. We disagree with this with this stance, and leads me to my C point under this, which is the goal is, or one of the essential parts is options. What is it that's best for me? What kind of educational system was best for Greg growing up, for Hannah, or for side government, or for anyone in the audience? Greg said, we're not all leaders. And let's face it, even here at King's, we're not all cut out to be leaders of strategic institutions. That's just not going to happen with every single person here. We're not even capable of it, not all of us. And especially, we're not capable of thriving in this environment. And you can add on, tie this to some earlier points if you'd like. When it comes to actually thriving, to take the government side logic, if it's actually all about your soul and you can't thrive in an environment of classical education, that proves that the decline is not something that we should regret. So moving on to my second crystallizing point, which is actual history. Now, we agree that the current educational state is not optimal. That's also not something that we're going to defend, that we have an amazing educational system. That's just not the case. We don't defend everything about the status quo system for education. Our argument comes from the third point under the first crystallizing point. Some children are meant to be classically educated. Some people are not. Some children are not. And we think people should be free to do either. But the decline of classical education is how we actually realized this. If we didn't actually have this decline, we wouldn't know what other options are out there. We wouldn't be able to have the advancements that we've had today. That was one of Hannah's main points in her LL about doctors, engineers, all of that. We've kind of lost sight of what the actual argument of that was. I'll get to that in my third point. But just remember that our opposing stance here is about results that work best for the child or for the adult or whoever's actually getting the education, and not what is the best system for everyone, because it doesn't actually work for everyone. If there was a system that worked for absolutely everybody, we would of course be in favor with it. Everyone would. But we don't think classical education is the system that does that. We don't believe in this one size fits all. So my third and final crystallizing point is specialization and exchange. So now, we've got a couple of vocations that we've been talking about through this debate. We've said doctors, I think we said lawyers briefly, we said businessmen, we brought up the GMAT. engineers. Let's add a couple more on. Let's add gardeners. Let's add welders, MTA employees. We can't survive in this city. Well, we could survive if we were super rich, but not all of us are super rich. We couldn't really survive or function very well in the city without MTA employees. But I would be willing to bet that a lot of, especially more laborious jobs, such as MTA employees, such as gardeners, weren't classically educated. The point being, obviously, in order to have a functioning society, we can't have everyone be classically educated. That's something Greg brought up in his last speech, that they need to defend that everyone needs to be classically educated. They even made the argument that if everyone was classically educated, we would have plenty of engineers and doctors and lawyers, and we simply don't think this is the case. A lot of Hannah's argumentation was simply just swept under the rug about how you wouldn't have, how this remedial education actually happens and how you would still have doctors and lawyers and all these people. But we think that you would have a lot more if you didn't have to force children to go through classical education. We're not saying people are, but we're saying if you actually want to do that, if you want classical education to become much, much, much more popular, we would see a decline in these sorts of vocations and technological advancements and actual tangible things that help people. Think about our advancements. They come about because of necessity, because people are working on farms or doing other menial labor. They don't become because kids are steeped in the classical works. Again, we don't say that these are bad things, but we say that you can't exclude these alternatives. At the point at which side government wants the debate to be about classical versus progressive, we think it's not about classical versus progressive. It's not a dichotomy like that. We think it's classical versus actually understanding what's best for the child, and that's why we proudly oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition whip and now call on the government whip to close out the debate. Here.
Here, here.
Is this a 5-minute speech?
And a 6-minute speech.
Today, I'll be closing for the government bench by addressing the problem with progressivism, why we should inculcate civic virtue in a democratic society, and how we should cultivate the whole human person. I'm going to be beginning with the problem with progressivism and also trying to weave in some of the rebuttal that we've heard from the last two speakers on side opposition. Now, what is the problem with progressivism? The problem that we've outlined for you today is that the progressive movement has distanced itself from a core curriculum of classes that's necessary to be taught to be a human person. Instead, it's focused on the individual's desire to pick and choose which classes they want to study. So the reality on the ground is that students pick and choose their own electives, their own courses, but the problem is that they don't know what's best for them. The idea of a liberal arts education, a classical education, is that you get beyond oneself to look to the wisdom of the past, to look to the wisdom of one's elders, to look back and discover the things that have been, the truths that are not easily accessible in one's own day. That's the argument that we heard from Luke on de Tocqueville. That's the argument that Lewis gives you on why we need to study old books, because it gives us perspective. But what's the reality on the ground? We see that the progressive education movement has no core curriculum, except, for example, in California, where they had 2 physical ed requirements. So obviously, progressive education, when you have those core curriculums, you're not going to be able to actually teach someone beyond what they self-select to want to learn. The reality on the ground is, we've heard all up and down side opposition that, well, we need to train for the technical skills, right? We need more engineers, more neuroscientists. But the reality is that status quo isn't teaching those technical skills in the first place to turn out the highly educated neuroscientists and engineers. In fact, as we pointed out, 80% of New York City graduates can't even adequately enter college on reading, math, and writing. We see that we're way behind the rest of the world on that score. So we regret the decline of classical education in that the progressive movement's inept failure to teach the basic core classes that need to be taught for a person to be able to function within society and to develop as a human being. Now, Greg says, well, we just need to fix the problem. We need more vocational training. But the problem is that this philosophy against classical education is intrinsic to the problem that we see today. He said and Will kind of got up in his last speech and said, well, their burden is to say that everyone needs to be classically educated. We simply think that that's preposterous. It's not at all our burden that everyone needs a classical education. We totally agree that we need plumbers, we need electricians. Not everyone needs to become a philosopher or a classicist. But we do think that everyone needs a basic core of knowledge to be able to operate as a human being. The core ideas that help them gain perspective, that help them operate in society. And Greg also adds that the problem is that there's a lack of funding in the status quo and that there's grade inflation. Well, first, funding is never correlated to performance. We spend billions on teachers and schools and see no correlative results. We see that Belgium and South Korea spend we spend 2 times more than Belgium and South Korea, and yet the scores are completely different. They have much better education. And Washington, D.C. spends 20 times as much as Utah, and yet Utah still scores better. So what's the answer? The problem is not funding. And secondly, the problem is not grade inflation. Grade inflation resulted from the self-esteem focus that the progressive education movement puts on students. Because in progressive education, it's all about you. It's all about what you want to learn and what you already come to the classroom knowing. You're born free. You already know these things. This Rousseauian idea that John Dewey incorporated into the classroom. So these problems are not incidental to the progressive movement. They are intrinsic to the progressive movement. So that's the problem with progressivism. So why do we need to inculcate civic virtue? We think that this is not just for something that exists for the ruling class, as they would have you believe that, only the study of the classics, that's the only reason that mattered in its historical context was that the ruling class, the wealthy, needed this. That's simply false. We think that a practical education has to teach an informed citizenry, and yet what we see from the progressive movement is that Harvard University seniors scored a D+ average on a 60-question multiple choice exam about civic literacy issued by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Less than half of the students who participated identified the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," as a line from the Declaration of Independence. Many of them identified it as the source as the Communist Manifesto, or said that it was an inscription on the Statue of Liberty. And in defense of this, a professor of American history at Columbia University, Eric Foner, said that this sort of test doesn't accurately portray, the actual knowledge of students about American history, because he says, quote, "It's become much more broad and diverse. The study of facts about particular battles has diminished, but maybe students are in a better position to answer questions about women's issues, African American contributions, and lesbian, gay, and bisexual history." That's the state of the progressive movement that has failed to teach civic virtue and has failed to teach a core curriculum. Or look at Bowdoin College, in which a class on gender and women's studies, which focused on the experience of women and men in light of the social construction of gender. So basically, it closes out philosophical discussion of issues by assuming that there's a social construction of gender in the first place and becoming over-specific in its focus. Once again, the students don't know what's best for them. In order to inculcate civic virtue, we have to have that as the core of freedom. In order to preserve freedom in any regime, we have to have this basic, classic moral teaching that makes us aware to the failings of our own time. So how do we cultivate a human person? Well, what does it profit a man to gain all utility but lose his soul? Let's stick with the classics. Thanks.
I thank both sides of the debate for a great debate. Now, the reason that we have public debates are twofold. We have them so that the school can come out and see some of its best debaters going at it over big issues. But also we like to have public debates in order to actually engage with these ideas, actually engage with these issues. Now, typically in a debate, whether you saw one in Interregnum or at a tournament, there would just be a debate and then everyone would leave the room and there wouldn't be a lot of opportunity to clarify anything that maybe the questions you had during the debate or maybe the thoughts or concerns that you had. In a public debate, we try to offer the audience the ability to ask some of those clarifying questions to the debaters themselves because we want to offer that opportunity for the audience itself to engage in these ideas and these issues. So we're now going to open up a period of questions in a panel to the debaters on each side. You can come up and offer a question. We're going to pull the mic out here. If that's good, okay, with our tech people, we're just going to pull it out here and turn it around, and you can ask some questions. All right. So, can I move this without breaking it? Okay. I guess that's up to me. if no one has any questions right now, I have a few of my own that we can start off the question time with. I have one for each side, and I try to make them hard because I like making them hard. So we'll start off with government. Ooh, that's loud. On government side, and you can all take a stab at answering this. This kind of came up a little bit on the concern of the opposition side. Is a classical education model necessarily elitist? And what I mean by that is, does it train certain students who have the aptitude necessarily to rule over others? Is it compatible with a democratic system? And any of you can take a stab at answering that, or all of you, if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I'd say specifically, I think progressivism is much more elitist. When you look at the principles that they use, in that everything that education is the purpose of preparing you for a job. So if you look at the history of progressive education, what it turned into is finding students early on, finding out what they were capable of, and separating them into tracks of what jobs that they could potentially do. It's actually very undemocratic. So you see in the early 20th century, you see a lot of students who, from the very beginning, don't have a chance to learn about philosophy or a lot of these things. I don't. So I would say it's much less elitist than progressivism, which purely views students as a commodity of what they're worth in the economic system once they graduate.
I think using the word sort of elitism already poisons the well. To some extent, education always has to be elitist just because of where the money is coming from. So if you're going to get a better education through one-on-one tutoring or something in the classics, or getting a private language tutor in Greek, you're going to have to be able to afford that. It's a better education in a lot of ways, and I think that argument can be made, but it's quite clearly not really good for everyone. But the same thing can be said of AP classes, same thing can be said about anything that correlates with income. So, I mean, yeah, to some extent, it would be elitist and it's not for everyone, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. I don't think it is, for the purpose of some people ruling over other people. I think it's less about society and more about the person, whether it's good for them. And it would be ideal if everyone could do that, but it's definitely not worth starving over. So, I mean, some people don't need to go to college. Maybe that's a little bit elitist, but I think that's just realistic. It's also good if some other people do go, and it's good for the people who go and the people who don't, that people do what they're good at and do what they're able to afford.
I think in a democratic society, it is helpful to have the civic virtue inculcated, and so I think that the liberal arts does that. And so if you're going to be able to participate in a democratic society, I think everyone has to have at least some basis in the liberal arts to understand and to be able to meaningfully participate in the system.
Thank you. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to come up and just line up back here. You don't have to wait until I'm not standing up here. My second question for opposition, and I try to make this hard too, is you say it's important to allow people to choose what they learn. My question is, how does a fifth grader or a sixth grader choose what they need to learn and need to be educated? Don't we, in some sense, always choose what they need to learn, at least at that level?
Okay, so you're getting sort of at my response and rebuttal to Luke's POI. I think that the method that the progressive education used initially, which is what Luke references by using, say, IQ tests or other forms of aptitude tests in order to divide students up into specific tracks, is probably not very effective, given that IQ tests don't exactly have the best. Well, they're not exactly the best testing method in the world. I think, though, that the best form of a progressive education, if you want to call it that at that point, allows students to elect a specific area that they want to focus on or a specific job that they want to pursue, and then sets up a rigorous curriculum to follow that. So you can look at a lot of European models that do this very well. You have to take tests even when you're in fifth grade, even when you're in eighth grade. I don't know the specific details, and they vary from country to country, but far more early on, you are required to elect into specific tracts. And I don't think that's entirely a problem. I mean, some people won't know, and they'll go into a general track. Some people will know, and they will get fast-tracked so that they end up beating the American system. I think that a lot of times the American system, because it doesn't impress the importance of electing a direction early on, is actually what leaves people sort of in this choice paradox, and they don't end up specializing, and that's why they're behind, and they have to take remedial classes. So that's my answer. I think, is that sufficient? Okay.
I have nothing to add.
Quick thing. I don't need the microphone though. Actually, at the university I was at last year, Xavier University, it's very well known around the country and even around the world. Like it's on the Forbes list. It's really great, especially business school. The language classes that they teach often use textbooks that are comparable to 6th grade textbooks overseas. It's because we don't have this sort of, as Greg's touching on, this fast track, this specialization early on. We don't identify like what they're actually meant to do, that we end up having problems where people float around from career to career, don't actually have any sense of fulfillment, and all problems associated with that. And so we do think like testing early on, like they do in France specifically, it would actually be a much better thing to incorporate in the United States.
Gov, you talked a lot about the canon of included in classical education. Could you perhaps clarify how a canon or particular work is established or authenticated?
I mean, Luke, you can jump in on this if you want to, but I mean, I would say that work's largely been done to a certain extent. I mean, there's generally a category of classics, the works that have been lasted throughout centuries. I'm not necessarily qualified to say what those are, but a lot of people spend lifetime studying it. I mean, you can just sort of look at the books that are more than 50 years old that people still read. That's a pretty good indication. You could narrow it down from there. But I mean, if you start out with that and then group it into the important